Okay. Hey everyone. My name's Ben Egliston. I'm going to be giving this lecture today called Watch to Play, Esport, Spectatorship, and Technicity, which is going to cover a range of things which, will hopefully be useful to you all in doing your own research on esports. So, just to begin, who am I? So I'm a postdoc research fellow at QUT, at Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and I work in the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT. I currently don't work on, any esports projects at the moment. Currently, I'm working on sort of two main projects, which are generally to do with the sort of politics and practices of data. So the first project that I'm mainly working on is one to do with how independent game developers in Australia use like data analytics software. And I'm also researching like the data politics of virtual and augmented reality technology. But yeah, prior to this, I did quite a bit of work on esports. I used to be really, used to be, I guess, much more, I guess, closely personally invested in esports than perhaps I am now. But yeah, I did my PhD at the University of Sydney, finished that in 2019. And that was a project that was really scoped around esports. It was particularly to do with sort of like these questions of the phenomenology of skill in video games. So kind of asking how, skill gets cultivated, how sort of like skill feels, sort of understanding the quite discrete, bodily processes, the kind of materiality of skill, and so on. And that was also really tied into this question of spectatorship, which I'll kind of get at in a little bit. So just to give you perhaps a sense of the structure of this lecture, I'm sort of going to begin by talking about esports in Australia. And this is not something that I think is hugely relevant to the overall theme of the lecture, but I think it is going to be useful nonetheless, particularly for those of you studying esports from other kinds of regional perspectives. I'm then going to talk briefly about the kinds of work that's been done around spectatorship and kind of introduce here the kinds of research questions, I guess, and identify the gaps in the literature that motivated my own research into spectatorship, and really just trying to think about and I guess elaborate on kind of currently existing answers to this question of, why do we watch, right? So the second part of the lecture, which is going to be the majority of it, is going to try and answer this question of what does watching mean for playing, right? And this is going to focus on the research I did in my doctoral work, where I looked at sort of the relationship between watching esports of the game Dota 2 and trying to sort of habituate or emulate the strategies that we'd sort of seen in those matches, right? And I guess part three is kind of a more it is kind of scoped around this question of futures, what's coming, right? And particularly trying to understand the kinds of futures of watching and surveillance, which I'm going to sort of tie into a case study of some more recent work I've been doing Dota and the use of kind of like data analytics tools and surveillance. So yeah, part one, as I said, esports in Australia. So like most regions of the world, right, esports is pretty popular in Australia. It's pretty widely watched. It's actually quite difficult to find a good estimate of how many people are actually watching esports in Australia and what the kind of viewership numbers actually look like. There's a report which you can kind of check out in the reference list at the end by Martin Gibbs and colleagues, where they kind of estimate that it's around 300,000 people who are watching the largest esports tournaments. So 300,000 Australians. The viewer cohort here looks something like largely 16 to 25-year-old males, right? And another pretty good source to try and understand kind of demographics of esports spectators in Australia is this report called the Digital Australia Report, which is a yearly report by the Independent Games and Entertainment Association, the IGEA, it's essentially a survey of Australian households, and it kind of asks them a bunch of questions to do with their own kinds of video game related consumption habits. So the report now includes and has included for several years these kinds of questions to do with like whether you watch games and whether you watch things like esports. So the report suggests that 41% of these surveyed respondents to these Australian households do watch esports, 38% of which enjoy the culture of esports, and over 1/3 of the people who watch esports who they surveyed do so to improve their gameplay, and nearly a quarter watch to follow an esports team. I think also here, as I've kind of noted, like an important question to kind of ask and something that might be useful from a kind of non-Australian perspective is, how is esports perceived in Australia, particularly by like, the news media, by policymakers and so on. And there's some good insight here offered by David Cumming, who kind of looked at the way that esports is talked about in a range of news media publications across Australia. And he kind of suggests that, esport is generally framed as like an investment opportunity. It's framed as having societal impacts. It's framed as something that's kind of on the cusp of entering into the mainstream. It's framed as something that's underdeveloped in Australia. It's framed as something that's sport-like, professionalized, right? So I don't think that this is very much, I think, in common with many other kinds of esports markets in kind of various regions of the world. I guess just in terms of thinking about the Australianness, perhaps as well, some of you may have seen this image from the Intel Extreme Masters, which is like the largest esports tournament that's been held in Australia, and it's typically held every year, but obviously with COVID, it's not being held this year or last year. And as we see here, we have someone doing a shoey, which is where you skull skull of beer out of a shoe, right? So maybe that is what the Australianness of esports looks like, or something that you might be familiar with. So why do Australians follow esports, right? And we kind of got a little bit of a sense of why from the previous slides, but the Digital Australia report, I think, once again provides a little bit of insight here. And the report would suggest that there are a number of reasons why people follow. They enjoy watching presenters, they want to support esports, they want to follow an esports team, they enjoy watching competitions, they enjoy taking part in player culture, and they want to learn strategies to improve their gameplay, right? So once again, I don't think that, and as we'll kind of get to in a bit, these sorts of motivations are not actually too unique, right? They're quite common with the kinds of motivations that other scholars studying, North America, Europe, and so on, have kind of found in looking at spectator motivations. So in Australia, there are a number of key Australian esports games, as Gibbs and colleagues identify. And again, these games tend to pretty much look like the kinds of dominant esports titles in esports more generally, right? So, like Counter-Strike, League of Offensive, League of Legends, Dota 2, so on. There are a number of key events that are held in Australia that compared to, like Asia, North America, Europe, there are comparatively little large esports events held here. So the largest esports event that has been held in Australia, and it's been held in Australia since I think 2017 or 2016, is the Intel Extreme Masters, which is a large international franchise. It's a Counter-Strike tournament. We also have things like the Overwatch World Cup, for instance, held here in Sydney in 2017. But as I'll kind of get to in a sec, right, like the kind of geographical, the kind of geographical isolation that we experience in Australia from the rest of the world is something that makes hosting these kinds of international esports tournaments here quite difficult and sort of often unfeasible. We also, we kind of want to recognize as well that when we're talking about esports, we're not just talking about like the big name kind of events, right? We're not just talking about IEM. We're also talking about things like, collegiate level esports. So we don't really call it collegiate esports in Australia, but sort of like university kind of esports, right? So many universities in Australia, much like in the US, have affiliated esports clubs. Some are like actually have affiliated esports teams, right? So like where I work at Queensland University of Technology, there is an affiliated team called the QUT Tigers, which you can see in the image on the right here. And that QUT, for instance, has like, university scholarships for esports players, just as you would with like athletes. And this is kind of a thing that we also see with, collegiate esports in the US, which is obviously, based on the kind of collegiate sports model, which is, of course, so popular in the US. And yeah, I guess, also having sports teams, acquiring esports teams. So like AFL in Australia, AFL teams have been, acquiring teams within the Oceanic Pro League for League of Legends. I believe at least one of these is now no longer being supported by either the Adelaide Crows or the Essendon Bombers, but there has been this kind of interest from more traditional sports in investing in in esports. So yeah, while esports is pretty popular and pretty widely spectated in Australia, it hasn't quite taken off as an Australian industry. And as I suggested, there is this kind of barrier of like geographical isolation. It's hard to host events here. It's also like if you're a prospective player, you'll generally have to move overseas if you want to actually participate in like competing in esports, because yeah, there's generally not many teams in Australia that you can join, right? Compared to like, in like China or America or wherever. So this is why we actually see many Australian players, particularly in games like Dota 2, actually moving to places like Malaysia, Singapore, and China to join teams, right? But yeah, we also kind of lack, internet in the internet infrastructure that would allow us to kind of play with a kind of broader international cohort. So in Australia, for instance, if you're playing like Dota 2, you because sort of the servers are located in different parts of the world, you essentially can't play with like American or European players because your like latency is going to be too high. So you're kind of stuck in this very like insular, like isolated kind of server. And where you also just don't have the same kind of like amateur to professional pipeline that you would in these larger regions where people are getting scouted by pro teams when they're playing in their own kinds of like amateur matches, right? So why do we watch? And I kind of alluded to this a little bit before. And, like this question of why we watch is one that tends to, within the context of like a wider esports scholarship, is something that it's a question that is I guess sidelined relative to questions about performance and the sort of politics of esports, which tend to focus more so on things like these kinds of tournaments or kind of the esports industry. But we generally and comparatively just lack studies of why people watch. So there are a number of studies done by a range of scholars looking at motivations. So these motivations, I won't kind of run through all of them, but they range from sort of like fandom, from wanting to learn, to be entertained, this kind of escapism, the acquisition of knowledge, or just this kind of like vibe or effective atmosphere of esports that allures, that's very alluring, right? So the kind of main thing that motivated me and the thing that I kind of got really interested in, because it was something that, I actually did as like a player of both World of Warcraft, which I guess is not quite an esport, but and Dota 2, where I'd kind of watch these games and try and essentially copy or emulate the sorts of things that I'd see players do. My kind of interest was really in understanding how people use esports as a way to learn and develop their skills, and to kind of draw on these strategies or tactics in their own games. So this kind of leads us to the second part, which is what does watching mean for playing? So yeah, as I said, I became very interested in this question of like what the impact of esport might be on how people play, which is certainly, as I said, a question that has been broached by a range of scholars for quite some time, right? Like, Chung and Huang's study from 2011, T.L. Taylor has been writing about this in her book on esports since 2012 when that book came out. But I was kind of informed here, I guess, as well by these kind of broader questions around like the kind of notion of paratext, which is like a very widely used sort of concept in game studies developed by people like Nick and Salvo. And the kind of general premise here being like if the game is the kind of main text, then the stuff surrounding it, like game guides or box art or like live streams or esports broadcasts, are these sorts of paratexts that have this really strong influence on how we interpret, derive meaning from, or engage with that primary text. So people like Chris Paul, for instance, writing on theorycraft, would sort of make the argument that like, these sorts of theory crafting resources are kinds of paratexts. But we might also think here about this kind of literature around metagames. So a range of people have sort of written on this topic. And with the metagame, I think is something that I'd imagine many of you are familiar with. It's kind of like emic term, right? It's something that really originated within competitive gaming communities, taken as like this kind of standard strategy that we sort of form either inside a game or sort of outside a game in these kinds of spaces like theorycraft. But what I kind of found across this literature was that not only was there kind of like a failure to think about how, to think about esports specifically in this kind of sense, in any sort of like meaningful or detailed way, but I also found that there was little attentiveness to how these forms of expertise that we watch in esports actually get taken up in the sort of routines, in the sorts of habits, the practices of these everyday players and spectators, right? So what I kind of became quite interested in then was this kind of, idea that like, if we are to take game skill and the cultivation of skill as this kind of thing that is this process that is both material, it's technical, but it's also thoroughly embodied, then how do we kind of think about the paratext? How do we think about things like esport as these forms of materiality that are increasingly shaping how many people cultivate skill, right? How do people develop, as James Ash writes, this kind of attunement to the game, this sort of like lining up of the rhythms of the body with those of the game, right? So I guess to kind of put it in the form of a diagram that I really like, which is taken from a book called Game Feel by Steve Swink, where he's kind of here diagramming the kinds of embodied processes that inform how we like do things with a game. So he kind of like is noting here that we've got like the kind of embodied, the somatic, the kind of specifically to the haptic and the gestural, right? The hands, the arms, but also the sorts of cognitive and perceptual kinds of processes, which are things that like obviously like we aren't consciously aware of, but are still incredibly important in shaping how we act towards a game, but also the technical, right? Like we've got the image on the screen, which is perhaps the most obvious, but also things like the feel of the controller, the kind of arrangement of various technical objects, such as the speakers, the console itself, right? So the question for me was like, if video game play and video game skill is this kind of assemblage of various human and non-human forces, objects, and conditions, then where do we kind of situate things like the paratext, or things like broadcasts of esport, which, as I kind of showed at the start, are something that many, many, many people are watching, right? So where do we kind of situate this here? So in terms of theoretical commitments, the work that I did drew largely on the concept of technicity, which I drew out of the philosophical project of Bernard Stiegler, the philosopher of technology. So I'll just kind of preface all of this by saying that, like, I'm going to offer like a really short summary, which I think does gloss a lot of the sort of detail and specificity in Stiegler's arguments. And I'll kind of like, I pointed towards two, one chapter and one paper that I wrote, which give a much more detailed account of like, you know, how and why I'm using this kind of theory. But just for the sake of this lecture, I've kind of glossed this. So the summary, I suppose, is that, you know, for Stiegler, the human being is always a technical being, right? Like any kind of human experience or action or perception must be understood with respect to some form of technology, to some form of material supplementation. So what he's kind of making a case for here, what he does make a case for in the first volume of Techniques and Time particularly, is a post-phenomenology, right? So if we understand phenomenology as this kind of study of experience, of perception, but typically one that privileges the kind of intentional subject, then the project of post-phenomenology is to really complicate this kind of thinking and really focus on how things like objects, things like materiality, things that aren't just the kind of human subject fold back into and shape human perception, shape human action, and so on, which is kind of something that, like, that diagram by Swink that I showed earlier is alluding to. So Stiegler's work in kind of thinking about post-phenomenology and sort of renovating, I suppose, traditional phenomenological ideas, it really follows quite closely some of the ideas from Edmund Husserl's phenomenology of time, right? So Stiegler is very much taking this idea of phenomenology of experience, of perception in terms of temporality, in terms of time. So his argument, Stiegler's argument, is that sort of any experience that we have of a future to come, any kind of forward-leaning anticipation, or any experience of the present, always emerges in relation to some form of technical materialization of the past, right? So some kind of artifactual exteriority. And he gives a number of examples throughout his books, but I think, you know, an easy way to think about this is like, if, you know, the words inscribed in a book, right, that might be set in something like a university course, these are, you know, a materialization of some kind of past, a past that we might not have lived ourselves, which, as we read, as we reflect on the ideas here, might go on to shape how we think about and engage with the other topics or ideas in that university course, right? We might also think about how, in the context of like cinema, a particular scene that we see at one moment, you know, will go on to shape our experience of the kinds of subsequent scenes. Or, you know, it might leave us with a kind of sense of anticipation of what's to come, right? If it's like a scene in like a horror movie that's particularly suspenseful. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the actual project that I did before I kind of discuss some of the findings. So the kind of question that I was asking in my work was how to broadcast esport condition the technicity of playing video games. So video games and video game skill is typically something that could be understood as, a process of playing, of kind of repetition, of trying to learn and anticipate what's to come so that we can master it, as people like David Sudnow would suggest in his work on Breakout. My kind of focus was on, where does esport as this massively consumed thing fit into the equation? So the work that I did was focused on a study of Dota 2. So Dota 2, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but I'll kind of provide a very quick overview. So Dota 2 is a competitive 5 versus 5 player PC game. It's specifically a multiplayer online battle arena game, which is sort of quite similar to like an action RPG, I suppose. It's high fantasy themed, and yeah, it's a game that's really popular. These stats are a little bit old, but these are from like 2019, I believe. But yeah, it was at that time played by over 13 million people per month. And the basic sort of gameplay involves picking like a mechanically unique character or what is called a hero, with the goal of fighting the other team's heroes and ultimately destroy their base, which is like a kind of heavily fortified, guarded structure that you need to kind of infiltrate and destroy. So yeah, one of the kind of things with Dota 2 is that it is regarded as very, very like difficult, right? It's a game that is very hard to get into. It can be quite sort of intimidating, right? But it's also a game that is incredibly hard to master, right? So this was kind of one of the reasons why I was interested in researching Dota 2. I was also playing a lot of Dota 2 at the time, and as I said, I'd actually been kind of using the strategy that I'm describing here, like watching esports players and trying to emulate their strategies in order to get good at the game, essentially. So as part of this project, I did 24 interviews, semi-structured interviews that I'll talk about in a sec, with Dota 2 players who also identified as viewers of esport. The sort of questions were generally to do with like what these people did when they watched esport, and many of them did talk about this kind of close relationship between watching and playing. In doing the interviews, I want to talk a little bit about method here, because I think it is important, and yeah, hopefully it will be something that is helpful if you are doing this kind of research. So I used a technique called interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is sort of an approach for interview research within like phenomenological kind of research more generally, where you're kind of developing these questions that really focus on the participants' experiences as a relationship between the subject and the world. I think IPA really does, as we kind of see from this, right? Like if the questions are focusing on relationships between subjects and worlds, IPA, I think, is something that actually works really, really well for like both phenomenological inquiry, but post-phenomenological inquiry as well. And yeah, it's essentially, you kind of want to focus on these sort of very open-ended kind of questions where participants really have the time to speak, to give participants the opportunity to talk in their own words, right? You kind of really want to limit your involvement as an interviewer if possible. But I think crucial to this, and something that I actually really wanted to flag, is that there was, for me, a really important autoethnographic kind of consideration. So like the project more generally was informed by my autoethnographic methods of being like a Dota 2 player and someone who watches, or at that point watched a lot of Dota 2. And I think that, you know, this is really important if you're doing these kinds of interviews with people who are talking about like a really kind of tacit skill or knowledge, because they're often going to speak in ways that are like really, you know, jargonistic, or ways that, you know, where they kind of assume that you're familiar because it's something that they're so intimately familiar with, right? And I think that, yeah, being able to being sort of conversant with this sort of study material, I think, is really key in being able to quickly come up with further questions during the interview, and so on. So I think, yeah, autoethnographic methods, if you are doing this kind of research, I think are super key in getting the most you possibly can out of the interviews. So I'm going to talk a bit now about this sort of question of what does watching mean for playing, and kind of answer it by kind of going through a bunch of stuff from my research. Particularly, I'm going to present a bunch of like quotes from my participants, which I've used. Some of them I've used in publications, which I think I've linked in the reference list at the end, but some of them are not. Some of them are not from publications. And yeah, I'm just going to kind of talk through and sort of talk through some of the themes there as it relates to this kind of question. So there were sort of like two main kind of overarching themes in the interview material. The first was that people watched esport to develop skill, and that they were able to successfully emulate, or they thought they were successfully emulating the techniques that they'd seen. So this is going to be sort of the first part. You know, as we see from this quote, which I won't read out. I won't read out many of his quotes because some of them are quite long. You know, this player here talks about watching the very famous Canadian Dota 2 player Arteezy. And Arteezy is known for like being a really kind of efficient player, right? He's kind of perfected these kinds of rhythms, I suppose, these spacings and timings of the body in kind of executing these really efficient kinds of play. So the kind of point this participant is making is that they sort of studied Arteezy's play in order to make themselves more efficient at playing Dota. And as I kind of mentioned here, it's way less about like the emulation of a specific strategy, but just like studying the kinds of spacings and timings of Arteezy's play, rather than sort of like, you know, more broadly copying a kind of tactical strategy. We also see much the same here about these kinds of like learning of the rhythms of play, right? It's very much about you're emulating these kinds of techniques. So again, this is not about copying a strategy as much as it is sort of trying to emulate the ways that professional players are able to play so efficiently. So this person is talking about the kind of use of key bindings on their keyboard, which allow them to more quickly move around the Dota 2 map, instead of like, moving their mouse and dragging it across the map, they can just use these kinds of quicker keybinds. This was another quote where someone talked to me about, like, and this was something I mentioned earlier about Dota 2 being a game that's like quite difficult, right? So this person mentioned to me that, like, it was quite intimidating for them to come into Dota 2 as a player who suggests that they're not very good at the game, right? And they kind of said that, there's over 10 years worth of development that's gone into this game. People have been playing this game for a really long time. And, essentially, like, being able to watch professionals play, people who are executing these like cutting edge strategies with high level skill, and kind of folding that back into their own play, allows them to kind of, it gives them a kind of shortcut, right? Or they think they get this kind of shortcut. So this player, I think, provided me a really interesting quote where they're talking about how it's the kind of watching esports does not strictly just provide you with these kinds of strategies that you straightforwardly follow and implement. It provided them a kind of knowledge that they could apply to specific situations that they were having with the game. So yeah, like, they kind of suggest that if their team that they were playing on had used like a really bad composition of heroes or characters, they have this broader knowledge that they'd kind of gleaned from that artifactual exteriority of esports, and were able to kind of suggest like alternative strategies that might lead them to win their games, right? I think it's also worth noting here that, as this participant notes, that the kind of formal elements of esports were really important. So, like, they talk about, like, as I say, commentary, camera work, statistics, replays, things like that. These were like techniques that we see in esports that help orient the viewer. They help them connect like the kind of current moment. They help them connect things that they're seeing, which they might have, or things that they might have missed, to the kind of broader unfolding of the match, the broader kind of narrative of the match. And yeah, and they suggest that, like, it's actually these formal elements. It's not just watching in and of itself. It is actually the production of esports that, as this kind of sports-like spectacle, that actually is something that specifically helps them learn how to play. But as I said, like, there's a sort of a second part to this kind of question of what does watching mean for playing. And in many of the interviews that I did, players kind of suggested to me that, well, it's not actually always this productive, right? It's like there are like these real tensions that emerge between the person who is trying to draw and emulate these kinds of strategies and their gaming body, where they're not able to really pull off the things that they're seeing. And there's kind of three main themes that I found here in terms of tensions, right? Firstly, we have these kinds of antagonistic relations between the players' bodily faculties and the strategies that they've seen. Second, an inability to habituate the spacings and timings of the body required in emulating the high-level techniques that they've seen. And third, the emergence of negative affective states such as panic or anxiety in attempting to replicate strategies. So in terms of like a kind of antagonism, right? Like, many, this is like a really common response. Many players sort of would suggest to me that, the kind of esports metagame really like standardized the way that people would approach the game, particularly in like higher level sort of matches of Dota. And they would kind of say that, you know, like if you weren't playing the kinds of heroes or characters that were in, because these like the good esports level heroes, you'd kind of get flamed or reported or something like that, right? And as they kind of say here, right, it's like it's really strict and regimented. It makes the game less fun, as they put it, right? It kind of limits many people's enjoyment of the game. But we also kind of see these sort of tension in the level of the body. You know, one player that I interviewed was talking to me about like essentially studying one of the more difficult and sort of like micro-intensive heroes. And yeah, they kind of said, you know, I'd studied, I'd watched someone play this hero so many times that I feel like I know how to do it. And then I'd go and I'd try and do the exact same thing. I knew what I needed to do, but I just didn't have that kind of situated knowledge. I didn't have that kind of deep ingrained tacit knowledge to actually pull it off. So I'd kind of mess it up in the match. Other players kind of suggested much the same, but were kind of talking about, you know, a kind of failure to pull off the kinds of maneuvers that they'd seen in matches that were like really temporally fine-grained. So the kind of thing they're talking about here, it doesn't really matter too much what they're talking about. I won't sort of explain in detail what mant dodging is, but basically it's a kind of technique where that to pull it off, you need to be you know, operating within kinds of like tenths of seconds, right? It's something that is only able to be done by having this really really deep attunement to the game, right? So yeah, I mean, this person kind of says that like they just can't do it, and like it takes up most of their mental processing power just to even think about doing it. And they compare that to like watching like a high level player just pull it off like it's second nature. And yeah, this was sort of one of my, I guess, favorite insights actually, where I interviewed a player who was talking to me about a kind of bodily tension that was this kind of more effective, something that happened at this more effective level, right? They're talking about this kind of like panic and anxiety, this like performance anxiety. And yeah, it's like such a fantastic quote. I just want to read some parts out of it where, so this participant was talking about like, again, seeing a strategy, thinking they could do it, trying to emulate it. And then they'd kind of go to do it, but they'd panic, they'd freak out. And as they say, you know, I'd start sweating, right? My hands not properly gripping the mouse. I'd be on full tilt. So like I'd sort of get flustered. I'd not be able to play properly. And as they go on to say further, like my hands would literally become covered in sweat. My grip on the mouse would slip, and I'll just miss. I'll just keep misplaying until I've essentially just died over and over and over and lost the game, right? So yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that was really interesting for me to see was not only like these more obvious tensions between like just the sheer skill disparity between an esports level player and like an amateur everyday esports player. But also these kinds of effective sort of tensions in the body, right? That players who do play esports certainly need to overcome, right? We might think of the work of people like Emma Wachowski on Counter-Strike players, where she talks about this kind of notion of the balanced body and how these really high-level esports players really need to learn how to like manage things like panic and anxiety, right? This is all a part of skill. Skill is not just this kind of broad level strategy. So the kind of last thing that I wanted to talk about, so part 3, is really focused around futures, and particularly the futures of watching and the futures of surveillance, right? Which is kind of, I haven't really talked about surveillance, even though it has been, I guess, implicit in what I've been talking about so far. So this kind of stuff comes from some work that I was doing at the end of my PhD, and I guess for a little bit following on from that. And I guess I got really interested in this, like kind of going back actually to Stiegler's work and kind of engaging more with sort of like the other part of his philosophical project. So what I described previously in the previous slides was the more kind of descriptive, constative account of a post-phenomenology. But the other aspect of Stiegler's philosophy, and what I think some people would argue is really the main aspect of Stiegler's philosophy, is that it is this really critical and political project, right? Where he's kind of arguing that like we're not only just like these technical beings. It's not only that we have this technicity, but it's that this technicity is something that is being increasingly captured and put in service of capitalism, right? So yeah, this kind of got me interested in these kinds of more critical political economic questions to do with like attention, the kind of attention economy, which is something that Stiegler talks a lot about. And this was happening around the same time that Valve released this sort of subscription-based add-on to Dota 2 called Dota Plus. So Dota Plus it's very similar to a kind of battle pass, which is also a thing that came out of Dota, but obviously is now something that's very, very it's a very popular way of monetizing your game. We see it in things like Fortnite and games like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds and so on, where the game is where you're provided this kind of additional content through like a monthly subscription fee, right? And Dota Plus is monetized in basically exactly the same way and offers many of the same kinds of things. It offers extra content at a monthly fee, where the base game is free to play. So Dota Plus is essentially a tool that provides you with like data analytics. So these kinds of data-based analyses, visualizations, and so on, of your own gameplay, but also like the gameplay of others. So it's this kind of like datavalence, this database surveillance of yourself, but also of other people. And this is very much framed around there's this very strong rhetoric of helping you get good at the game, helping you develop skill. As we see here, from the ad copy, it says, enhance your daily Dota experience with Dota Plus, a new monthly subscription service designed to help you get the most out of every match that you play. So I wrote, I've linked to the paper here down the bottom, and in this paper I kind of argue that, yeah, there's sort of three main kinds of surveillance that Dota Plus enables. So it provides a way to surveil the self, to watch and reflect upon your own play. It provides a kind of lateral surveillance, so a kind of surveillance where, you can sort of see other players and their performance, their strategies, but they can also see yours. And lastly, a kind of platform surveillance. So like how Valve is kind of drawing on information from the entire Dota 2 player base in order to create this product, to refine this product. Talk about this in a sec. And I kind of argue that the broader argument of this paper is that, these various kinds of surveillance and the way that they present information in this discrete form of data folds back in on and shapes how people think, how they feel, how they act in the game, and ultimately creates the conditions for like these positive, effective states to emerge, such that you might keep playing the game. As I mentioned, the game is very hard. At the time Dota Plus was released, Dota was, its overall player count was really waning. It wasn't really seeing an influx of new players, such that it did in sort of previous years. And yeah, ultimately sort of creating these conditions for positive, effective states, for engagement, and ultimately to sort of further capture the attention of its users. So there's several, as I said, there's several kinds of surveillance, and I'm going to sort of talk through some of these quickly because I'm just conscious that I'm nearing the hour. So firstly, we kind of see this sort of self-surveillance. So in the Dota Plus interface, in the sort of top left-hand corner of your screen, when you subscribe to Dota Plus, you're given a bunch of information about your own ongoing performance in that match. So this is very similar to the kinds of, quantified self style tracking about, knowing the self, generating knowledge about the self in order to improve yourself, or kind of what I've called elsewhere quantified play. So really riffing off this kind of notion of the quantified self and the sorts of common rhetoric surrounding the quantified self movement. And yeah, as we see here, it's like a positive performance is indicated by these green upward facing arrows. You can kind of just glimpse into the corner of the screen and just know that you're doing well or doing better than you normally would. But I guess like conversely, they will appear as these like downwards facing red arrows if you're not doing well. So as I argue in the paper, there's also the opportunity for creating these same sorts of feelings of anxiety that some of the participants in the previous study actually experienced, where you just feel that you aren't doing well, and that kind of affects how you play the game. But yeah, we also have this kind of lateral surveillance, which is a term that scholars like Mark Andreevich have used in their work, to do with, as I mentioned before, watching, but also being watched. And it's really like a dynamic that we see exemplified in things like social media. But yeah, with Dota Plus, for instance, you're able to kind of see these player base wide strategies or like trends. Again, with this kind of goal in mind of like drawing on this information to better yourself, but also worth noting that you yourself are being observed. You make up part of this data. You make up part of these trends that shape how other people play the game, right? And lastly, we have this kind of platform surveillance. So one of the things with Dota Plus is that Valve is basically drawing on millions and millions of games being played, drawing on the data and the information that they have about how the player base collectively is playing the game, and is able to provide you with sort of like suggestions on how you should play your current match based on their kind of information, their use of machine learning, and applying it to that kind of data set, right? So it can provide you with insight in how to play that is sort of contextually or situationally specific. So the idea here is that, it's very much about minimizing the need for accumulating knowledge firsthand. It's very much providing kind of an entry point, I suppose, for people who haven't, going back to that quote that I showed much earlier on, that haven't accumulated like 10 years worth of experience in their head and that they've practiced, but rather is a way to kind of shortcut that, right? And to allow people an entry point into the game. So this kind of surveillance, this kind of watching, this watching done by Valve is increasingly a central part of how people play the game, and increasingly a central part for how Valve is keeping players engaged with the game. So yeah, I guess just to wrap things up, I've kind of talked today about how, esports, in kind of the first part of the talk, esports has traditionally lacked this focus on what watching means for playing. And as I kind of showed, like, watching is really closely bound up with playing. These are not like two separate things. For many people, they're intertwined, right? Watching is a part of how we play. And kind of building on the kind of work that had been done in that space, I've kind of developed a more phenomenological or post-phenomenological account, which focuses on how watching is implicated in the kind of material and somatic processes involved in gameplay. And then lastly, I've concluded with a kind of account of more recent forms of watching that fall back in on playing with Valve's Dota Plus, a real kind of capture of this sort of like, wider technicity of watching and emulating. Yeah, so hopefully that's been of use. I provided the references at the end here, which might be also some useful further reading. And yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you all in the Q&A. Thanks.